So often when I speak to people about privilege, it can create a real reaction. And I understand that because for a long time I didn't understand privilege. And I didn't understand my own privilege at all because I was so busy looking at my disadvantages that I didn't understand that while I may have disadvantages, I also have privilege. And there are varying different degrees of privilege. And privilege isn't about discounting your struggles, and privilege isn't about dismissing your experience. Privilege is about understanding that you didn't have unnecessary barriers between you and certain experiences, while others do have unnecessary barriers between them and certain experiences. So when I hear it that way, it doesn't become a competition anymore. I start to understand that I didn't have certain hurdles in my race, and I have other hurdles. But where I didn't have those hurdles, that's privilege. Where other people did, it's not that these hurdles should be there. It's that actually what we need to start doing is thinking about where the hurdles are unnecessarily for others when we're thinking about privilege, and how we can be part of not perpetuating those hurdles. And that's a really hard thing to do because it doesn't directly influence us or impact us. So when we don't have those hurdles, we don't know that they're there. But then when we are educated about being there, we can become a bit defensive because what we naturally do is go to what hurdles are there for us. And that in itself is dismissing. We can sit with our own truth that we have some hurdles and some privilege, while others have different hurdles and different privilege. And when we start competing privileges and barriers, it becomes really, really dangerous because what we're starting to do is discount different people and different people's experiences. And I just haven't found that to be helpful in any discussions with anybody ever, even outside of the area of diversity and inclusion. So what I would say is if the conversation of privilege is uncomfortable, it's really important for you to really question why. Because when I look at my privilege, I can see that while I had barriers and limitations, I had privileges that others from other backgrounds and other experiences wouldn't have had. There would have been more hurdles in front of their access. And so it would have required more resilience, more grit, more energy just to access the same thing that I have access to. And what that does on a personal level is it makes me aware of the fact that a lot of my outcomes aren't simply based on hard work. Or while the hard work was part of it, because I had hurdles and limitations to work with, as does everybody, different ones at different degrees, I also have to acknowledge that had I not had certain privileges, it would have been even harder and I may not have made these achievements. And so sometimes understanding that systems are set up to support certain types of people and not others is really hard to hear when the system worked for you. And it's really hard to hear when you have conquered something or overcome something, because it can often feel like if they just applied my thinking or my approach or my experience to their life, they'd be fine. But what we're discounting is their starting point. So what we do when we think about privilege is we discount the many statistical and data-driven reasons that somebody may not have that level of energy, that level of resilience in those moments. They may not have that willpower. They may not have that support. We don't count any of these things, but actually we all start at different starting points. And so to get to different places has different lengths of road, but also that road may have more barriers than others. And so why I'm talking about privilege is that the majority of conversations I have about privilege are people who are deeply uncomfortable with the conversation. And that's often because they're deeply uncomfortable with their privilege. And that's where I would have started in this journey, is understanding that. And so the remedy as I see it, and I'm open to being informed, but the remedy as I see it is about actually listening to the experience of others without comparing it to our own. So it's listening to understand it from their perspective. It's not about expecting them to understand it from ours, because when we all talk about our own lives, we talk about it from our experience. And asking anybody to reevaluate their experience simply based on ours is dismissing of their actual lived experience, because some of the limitations are conscious and are visible and are evident, and some are unconscious. And so it's really important that when we hear somebody from a different experience, that we hear that their experience is different and that their journey has been different, and that we don't apply our experience to that to invalidate it in some way, or to validate it. Sometimes it's actually about listening and understanding people's experience as it is and validating that, as opposed to deciding what is valuable about their journey or their story and what isn't valuable about their journey or their story based on what we prefer, based on what we value. And that's really fundamental in inclusion, is understanding that it's not about what we value and deciding if somebody's story or journey or limitations are valid based on our values. It's actually understanding that everybody's experience is valid based on their experience and their values. And opening ourselves up to the fact that our experience isn't the only experience, even if it's the dominant one or the one that is most rewarded or supported. And when we think like that, it goes way beyond inclusion. It starts to create insight that allows us to learn, which is really important. When we have privilege, we need to learn. And it also allows us room to expand our own thinking and our own bias and our own limited views of the world, which may reward us to a great degree, but they also may be limiting us. They may be limiting our relationships. They may be limiting our insights. They may be limiting our ability to understand equality, because we may be busy looking at what we lose, and we may not even be conscious of it, because when we're in privilege to create more equality, we don't get some of the unconscious benefits we've been reaping for years, and we start to become conscious of them and hopefully take responsibility and move from the intention of being inclusive to the impact, which means behaving and acting in ways that allow others to either leverage our privilege in some way, or that we don't use it against others without that privilege. And that's really hard when we're raised in societies that value competition, and it's really hard when we're working in settings that require you to be better than others, because then what happens is we have to figure out what's valued and considered better, and then we replicate that, which creates lots of this assimilation bias. And that's kind of how privilege kind of impedes in systems, is that what happens is we create a set of values, not always overtly, but we have a set of things that we value and appreciate and reward. And then people who look like what we think, or people who act like what we think equals these values, gets rewarded. And so in doing so, we start to create environments and groups of sameness, and that becomes the norm. And when that becomes the norm, we have privilege by being part of that norm, which means that others have a lack of privilege or have barriers to accessing it because they may not look or speak that way or bring what is currently being valued. But that doesn't mean that they don't have something valuable to bring. And that's how we work with our privileges, opening up our ability to allow room for other valuable inputs, other values, other understandings and insight. And there's loads of research already about how that's innovative, and how that provokes more innovative and effective working groups. But we have to think about our privilege, and that's really uncomfortable. And there's all sorts of privilege in different settings. And then there's like global privileges. But we need to think about what our privilege is, so that we don't wash our privilege over other people's experiences and discount their difficulties. And if we have an issue with that, we really need to look at ourselves. Like, we really need to look at ourselves. Why? What do I think that means about me or will do to my identity if I understand that I have advantage by simply not having certain barriers that other people do have? Like, what is my real resistance to that? And that can be really helpful. How do I benefit by resisting that? So that's what I would always ask myself. What am I benefiting by resisting that? And that helps point me towards some of the identity pieces that I've built up, some of the narratives that I've built up around different pieces. So what am I benefiting by not hearing that? Or what am I benefiting? How am I benefiting by rejecting that? And that can be really helpful for helping us start to move beyond our unconscious bias, our blind spots, and our our resistance to acknowledging our privilege. And everyone has privilege in some way, you know, and all privilege from my perspective means is that I don't have barriers that other people inherently have. That's all. Based on how society is designed, or set up, or functions. It's not that I got a leg ahead. So it's not necessarily, while that is actually the impact, it's not necessarily that I'm better off than other people. But it is that I don't have certain barriers they have. And in doing so, I'm able to access certain experiences with more ease than they are. And I just don't see why we'd be resistant to understanding that. And that goes across, you know, the different categories of discrimination, but it also goes just across people who are different to us, you know. How are we listening to people, and how do we benefit by not listening to them? And I think that's the quickest way to understand our privilege. If you'd like any more information around it, or you'd like to have a discussion around how privilege might be impacting you within your work as a leader, or executive, or if you're working in HR, OD, or training and development, and you want to raise awareness within your organisation around privilege, you can pop me an email to info@sheilawalsh.com, and we can have a confidential consultation to see what you need and to see if there's some way I can help, or if there's another route that might be better suited for you. I look forward to hearing from you. Yeah. And I hope this has provoked thought. I hope it's provoked your thinking. Thank you.